Let everyone sit down.
Did you accidentally summon me?
Who? Who's that?
I think that was yours.
Me? It's on silent. What's the matter with it? I need a new phone. It's really badly behaved. Right, order. Mr. Rycroft, a very warm welcome on our first day back. It's good to have you before the Select Committee again, and we have, as ever, a lot of questions that members of the committee would like to ask. Can I begin by looking at no-deal planning?
Sure.
And the role that DexEU has got for this. Is one of the risks that you're concerned about is that there could be queues of lorries on the M20 because of delays at Dover and Calais?
So the role of DexEU in no-deal planning is to coordinate activity across government. We've been working on that for over 2 years now. There are 300 work streams across government which we monitor on a constant basis. Included in that are clearly issues around the border, about planning for the border in both a deal and a no-deal scenario. So all of that is encompassed in the work across government. I should point out, of course, that the DexEU role in all of this is to coordinate across government, to monitor the progress against all of those work streams, and to give ministers collectively the assurance that that work is going across government effectively. The ownership of all of those work streams rests with departments. So in the context of lorries and queues into Dover and so on, the planning for that is a responsibility of the Department for Transport.
Right, but can you just confirm to the committee that what is one of the risks of no deal that this whole set of work is planning for?
What I can confirm to the committee, absolutely, there are plans to deal for all possible scenarios, deal and no deal, including issues around the border and the flow of traffic across the border.
Right. Now, it was reported in one national newspaper that the government is making provisions for portable loos to be stuck on the M20 in the event of there being long lorry queues. Can you confirm whether that is something the government is doing?
That's an interesting question, Chair. In terms
it is.
of
I was looking for an answer.
Yes, I'm sure you are. In terms of the detail that you're taking me into there, as I say, the ownership of all of these plans rests with relevant departments. What I'm confident is that there are plans in place across those 300 work streams, across every aspect relevant to no deal and no deal in terms of domestic preparedness, including planning for the scenarios that you're outlining. If you wish to go deep into the detail of all of that, I would ultimately have to refer you to the Department for Transport, who own that set of issues in terms of the planning.
If you're saying to us you haven't seen a piece of paper in your role as Permanent Secretary on which that contingency arrangement is listed, and I presume that's what you're telling us.
No. So we have plans in my department.
Right.
We have seen all of those plans. We hold all of those plans. We ask departments to keep those updated. So my team has access to all of those plans. There are 300 plans.
Yep.
You are perfectly at liberty to ask me about details such as portaloos on the motorway for queues of lorries, but if you wouldn't expect me to be able to answer that level of detail across 300
No,
plans.
I understand that.
The assurance I can give you is that those plans are in place, that there are a level of detail which satisfies the team in DexEU, that we're constantly monitoring those plans to make sure they're kept up to date, and that we give the assurance to ministers collectively that work is going on adequately across government.
Now, that sounds to me like an answer which says the report in the paper was correct. Now, the reason I raised it is because it was also reported that the government is using non-disclosure agreements with suppliers in respect of no-deal planning. Can you tell the committee whether that is correct?
So there are discussions going on with various actors in the private sector. about the actions that they may have to take in a no-deal context. There's clearly our confidentiality requirements around some of those discussions because there are commercial issues at consideration, but there are also negotiation sensitivities. So quite a lot of the work that we do is kept within government or close to government because of those sensitivities. This is a debate that I've had with the Public Accounts Committee on 2 occasions about how much of the government's planning is in the public domain and how much is kept behind closed doors. And clearly, across that range of work streams, a lot of the work we do is negotiation sensitive, and hence the confidentiality.
I do understand that. I was just looking for a simple confirmation that the government is using non-disclosure agreements with suppliers, yes or no?
The government has non-disclosure agreements with some of the private sector actors we're talking to in this space.
So that's helpful. Now, turning to the first tranche of no-deal advice notes, technical notes, however one describes them, one of the issues identified was the risk that UK citizens living in other EU countries might have problems about getting their pensions paid because of financial services and the rules relating to that. Can you say anything about what the government is doing, A, to alert UK citizens, or are you leaving that to the companies, and B, to try and mitigate that potential risk?
So what I can say about the consequences of Brexit for both EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU27 has been central to our planning for both deal and no deal. As the committee is well aware, we have in the deal context a good outcome for UK citizens abroad, which is why it's important, one of the very good reasons why it's important to get a deal this autumn. But we also have planning going on across government to ensure that the interests of EU citizens living in the EU27 are looked after in the unlikely event of a no-deal scenario. That includes issues such as pensions and healthcare and so on. That is absolutely at the forefront of ministers' minds. It will be a decision for ministers about what information to put into the public domain to offer those reassurances and when to do that. But
ministers have already chosen to put into the public domain the fact that there might be a problem. The question I was asking is, because not all of those pensioners necessarily have read the technical notices or the papers when they came out, what is being done to alert them to the fact that this could potentially be a problem, and what is being done working with the companies who are currently paying the pensions to find a way of overcoming this potential risk, which could be very serious for people?
Of course, and this is very high on our list of concerns about a no-deal scenario. The notices that went into the public domain the week before last, of course, are not the end of this story. There is further information to be put into the public domain across the range of our no-deal planning work, and it will be for ministers to decide when to do that in relation to UK citizens in the EU and what information and how that information is transmitted to them. But clearly, for that to be effective, we have to find routes to ensure that information reaches the right people. And while I'm not at liberty to say much more about that now, because that's for ministers to set out, clearly we are thinking hard about, if you like, the effective routes to ensure that those who need to know about what they might have to do, citizens and businesses across the range of these issues, do have that right information.
Fine. So to sum up on that, ministers have, working with ministers, you've identified that as a risk, but ministers have not yet decided what to do about communicating it, apart from publishing the technical notice.
If I may correct you, we have identified the concern clearly and the risk, but ministers will make the decision about when to put into the public domain the action that the UK government will take, and to set out how the right information will be got to those people.
But just so that I'm clear, ministers will decide when to put it into the public domain about the action. Does that mean taking the action or taking it before and then letting people know afterwards?
It depends slightly on your definition of action, of course, doesn't it? So information, as the first round of technical notices was, a lot of that was about information for businesses and citizens and others about what might pertain in the unlikely event of a no deal. It wasn't requiring people to do anything at that stage. So there is a distinction between information and action, and the technical notices have been put in the public domain. Hitherto have mainly been about information, telling people, setting out very clearly, I hope, what the action the UK government would take, what its policy would be across those that range of issues in the event of a no deal.
Fine. Okay, but we're talking about 7 months away, so it's not very long. Can I just ask you when the next set of no deal planning advice notices is going to be published? Because it was indicated, as I understand it, it'd probably be in 3 tranches, and we've had the first lot. When's the second lot going to appear?
You have the advantage of a oral statement from the Secretary of State, Mr. Raab, this afternoon. Again, the decisions about what goes into the public domain are ones for ministers.
So we'll find out this afternoon, is that it?
I say you have the opportunity to ask him the question this afternoon.
All right, okay, I will do that, fine. And lastly from me, can you tell us who is on the EU Exit Interministerial Group? What is the membership?
So that is a group that's chaired by the Secretary of State. I'm now stretching my mind to know whether the membership of groups is in the public domain or not, but the ministers around that table are gathered together to give us an overview of the planning work that we're doing, the preparedness work we're doing across government. If you would excuse me, if I will write to you if the membership of that committee is something that is appropriate to be in the public domain. I can't for the life of remember.
I'm struggling to think why the membership wouldn't be appropriate to be in the public.
But you have me there. But as I say, the purpose of the committee is to act as a checkpoint. It's met over 20 times now on the work going across government on deal and no deal planning. It has the ability to call in issues where there are concerns about the state of progress and cross-examine other secretaries of state, other ministers and officials to make sure that that work is advanced appropriately.
It has been reported, I think, because the Institute for Government had a FOI request, which is why we know about its existence, because the government obviously wasn't very keen to release it. Is the Treasury represented on the committee?
Yes.
It is. Is the Cabinet Office represented on the committee? Yeah. And then you've just said that other ministers, presumably are called in, or officials, to check on the progress of their planning?
Yeah, so we, service that committee, DexEU. If we have concerns about any of the work going on across government, either individual issues or systemically, that is our first ministerial port of call to ensure that those issues are examined and action is taken to resolve them.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. John Whittingdale.
Good morning, Mr. Rycroft.
Good morning.
When DexEU was established, it was explained that it would have the overarching responsibility for preparing for Britain's exit from the EU, whilst the planning at each individual level would be done in departments, and that DexEU would also represent the UK in the negotiations. And you sort of set that out again today. In which case, why then was the overall responsibility taken away from DexEU suddenly and put into the Cabinet Office?
Are you asking the question about the creation of the Cabinet Office Europe unit? So going back over a year
I'm talking
now,
about the machinery of government.
The recent machinery of government change.
That the overall responsibility now lay in the Cabinet Office rather than your department.
So clearly there is a history here. I came into the department in March last year as the second Permanent Secretary to support the then Permanent Secretary Ollie Robbins. I became Permanent Secretary when the Cabinet Office Europe unit was created in October last year, with the prime responsibility for Ollie Robbins to act as the Prime Minister's Sherpa and to be the official lead on the negotiations. That's the situation that's pertained for over a year now. Clearly there was a machinery of government change which is subject to your interest today, recently, which, as the Secretary of State described it, made some modest changes to responsibilities appropriate for the stage we're at in the negotiations. And if you give me a minute on just to explain precisely what those changes are, as it's worth, I think, understanding that. So the formal change was that advice to the Secretary of State, who continues to lead politically in the negotiations in terms of being the Prime Minister's interlocutor with Mr Barnier We'll get his advice on the negotiations from one source from Cabinet Office Europe unit. We've transferred a modest number of staff to the Cabinet Office Europe unit to support them through this stage of the negotiations as we drive to the wire to get this deal over the line. And I've loaned them a few other staff in addition to that, again, fit for the circumstances. The other side of the coin is confirmation of the very wide range of responsibilities that DexEU continues to have, but critically also identifying that DexEU is responsible for the preparations for what comes after a deal is achieved in this round of the negotiations. The preparations for the negotiations to implement the detail that will be set out in the future framework. So all of this makes sense certainly from our perspective, seen in the light of the stage we're at in the negotiations. A focus to support Mr Raab and the Prime Minister in the negotiations from Cabinet Office Europe unit, a focus in DexEU, continuing all our other work on domestic preparedness, on legislation, on engagement, third country deals, on working with the devolved administrations to make sure that the government is ready for whatever comes after the deal being signed off. If I just add one final thing, this is not about excluding DexEU from the conduct and the process of the negotiations. We have a deep well of expertise in my time, in my department, built up over the last couple of years, people who understand the policy background, understand the negotiating modalities of this, and members of my department, staff from my department, are out in Brussels every week supporting the Cabinet Office Europe unit in the conduct of those negotiations. We've always been very closely aligned. You would expect that, and we continue to be closely aligned.
But a change occurred.
Yes.
The machinery of government notice says this is a change of overall responsibility. Why was the change made?
The answer to that question is that this is, as I said, is about the stage of the negotiation we're at. It was a clarification of the lines of, if you like, of who provided advice to ministers, particularly on the negotiations, and that was deemed appropriate by the Prime Minister to have that clarity at this stage of the negotiations as we go into the final furlong, if you like, on the withdrawal agreement negotiations. But also sitting back from that, thinking, okay, a lot of the political and the focus of government is on getting those negotiations completed. But we need to be ready for whatever comes next. So that tasking, the team in the Cabinet Office Europe unit supporting the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister to move those negotiations forward to a successful conclusion. My challenge in this, as well as continuing to support that work, is to ensure that when we get over that line, there isn't a pause while we regather our forces and think about what we do next. We are ready for that next stage of this journey. That's hugely important. In all being well, the implementation period will start at the end of March next year. That gives us a timetable to secure the finalisation of our future relationship. That is something that we absolutely need to be ready for.
But the change took place not when a conclusion had been reached and a new part of the process was initiated. It took place right in the middle. And the only conclusion, really, that it is possible to draw is that the Prime Minister decided she did not have confidence in her Secretary of State as the lead negotiator and wanted her own person to take over.
I absolutely would not draw that conclusion. The machinery of government change, the recent machinery of government change, took place a few weeks ago. If you look at what's happened subsequent to that, Mr Raab has met Mr Barnier 4 times, as recently, obviously, as Friday. That does not suggest to me that you could put the import on that change that you're implying. Clearly, the Prime Minister is ultimately in charge of these negotiations. But Mr Raab is our interlocutor with Mr Barnier, works clearly very closely with Ollie Robbins, gets the support from the Cabinet Office Europe unit in order to transact that negotiation and to support it through to a successful conclusion.
But arguably, what you have just described was the situation before the machinery of government change was announced, that the Secretary of State was conducting negotiations and had responsibility, and obviously the Prime Minister ultimately has responsibility, but this was very specifically an announcement that lead responsibility no longer rested with your department and was now the responsibility of the Cabinet Office under Ollie Robbins?
Sure, as I describe it, it's not as dramatic a change as some people I think have made out. The clarification is that there is one source of advice to ministers on the negotiations of withdrawal agreements that are taking place now. That advice comes from the Cabinet Office Europe Unit. They will draw as appropriate on folk in my department where they require that expertise, as indeed they will from other departments. That, frankly, is not a huge change in the work that we're doing, and nor is it a change in the position of the Secretary of State, who continues to perform, as you rightly point out, the role that Mr Davis performed before Mr Raab.
I mean, you say it's not a huge change, but I mean, from what you're suggesting, actually it barely merited a public notice.
You might suggest that. I think in terms of the number of staff involved, machinery of government changes, usually there's hundreds of folk moving this way or that and lots of money going with it. Just to put this in perspective, if I may, the number of staff involved was, in terms of the machinery of government transfer itself, was at 18. And I have loaned to the Cabinet Office Europe Unit a further 16 people. I continue to pay for those folk. The 18 have gone under machinery of government rules. The money goes with them. That's the way the rules work. But I can assure the committee, for what is a relatively modest exercise, we have kept the bureaucracy and the distraction around all of this to the absolute minimum so that we can all get on with the job that we have to do.
Okay, Peter Bowden.
Thank you, Chairman. You talked about the no-deal scenario. I mean, basically, it means not reaching an agreement with the European Union, but coming out on a World Trade Organization agreement as far as trade goes. How likely do you think that is?
Thank you, Mr. Bain, for that question. And I'm sort of flattered that you would ask an official for his views on the likelihood of no deal. That is the sort of question, if I may, that is more appropriate to put to ministers. I'm here to talk about machinery of government change. I'm an official. What I would say, the government line, as you know, we hope and expect to get a good deal this autumn. That is what government is bending its will towards, but no responsible government would not plan for any possible scenario, which is why I am tasked by ministers to plan for a no-deal scenario, and that's precisely what we're doing.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, is the witness able to tell us then when he thinks a decision has to be made about a no-deal agreement? Because clearly we can't get to the 28th of March and as they say, oops, we're not going to have an agreement. Following day, there's... What's the sort of time frame on that, do you think?
So that is a very fair question.
Thank you.
And clearly the work that we've been doing over 2 years has been preparing, giving advice to ministers, preparing for that scenario. The ministers determined that now was the right time to put the technical notices into the public domain. There are more to follow in relatively early course, which will complete that suite where ministers think it is appropriate that businesses, the public and others understand what actions the UK government would take in a no-deal scenario. Clearly, beneath the surface of that, there is a whole range of other planning work that we're doing. Part of that is about giving advice to ministers about what would need to be done when in order to be ready for a no-deal scenario the 29th of March next year. Again, there is a lot of detail there which in this case in particular is rather negotiation sensitive. So the government, I think, would be, ministers would be a bit leery about putting all of that into public domain, but the assurance that I can offer the committee is right the way across government. The work is going on to ensure that we would be ready for the unlikely event of a no-deal scenario at the end of March next year.
The government might be ready, but if I was in the airline industry, and I declare an interest, sir, that I obviously was involved in the travel industry.
Sure.
And there's a lot of forward planning. I would have thought that if you got to the October summit and there was no agreement, the government really would be obliged to tell industry that actually we've tried, we can't, both sides have tried, we can't reach an agreement. Therefore, 29th of March, what will happen? Well, surely between October and March, the government and the European Union will try to reach an agreement, say, on keeping airlines flying between Europe and the UK. So that it must be around that region when that decision has to be made. Would that be fair?
You're right to point out there aren't many months left between now and the end of March next year. If we're into a no-deal context, there is a lot of action for government. There's also a lot of action for businesses. Alerting businesses to what might have to be done is part of the process of publishing these technical notices, and more to follow in the wake of that. If you like, sets business on notice. These are the sorts of things that you might have to consider if we're in a no-deal context. But as I said in answer, I think, to one of the Chair's questions, that's about alerting people to what might happen. There then follows a stage where, if we're into a no-deal scenario, that would have to turn into action at some point. And that is all baked into our planning, the advice that we give to ministers.
And it's that point I'm trying to draw out. I mean, clearly it's not September, and it's clearly not March. So is it the end of October? I mean, surely industry and the public have a right to know when that sort of decision has to be made. And in a ballpark area, I mean, do you think October, November?
Well, as you say, it's somewhere between September and March. And the precise points at which ministers decide to put information into the public domain is a decision for ministers, because this sort of information, of course, has consequences. If you're asking businesses to do certain things, that may have cost implications. So those are decisions which have to be taken with some care. It's my job to ensure, one, that we understand what the implications are for businesses. We may at some point in this discussion get onto our programme of engagement, but we do a lot of work with business to understand where their concerns are, what their own contingency planning look like, what their timetables are. We funnel all of that advice into ministers. We consider...
sorry to interrupt, because I think we're aware of that point, Chairman. But what I was just saying, I guess you're not going to tell us, or you're not going to tell us what your advice would be to ministers when that decision has to be made. But you would accept, sometime between now and the 29th of March, the government has to decide that if we cannot reach agreement, we must tell the public and industries and business that there is not going to be a deal.
I think that is self-evident.
And it's got to be earlier than March.
Yes.
So at least we've got it back to February, at least, Chairman.
All right. Now, Stephen Crabb wanted to come in on the back of this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Rycroft. Just following on from your remarks in answer to Mr. Bone's question, not so much interested in specific time frames, but are you working to the assumption that at the point of no deal, you will then move into a different phase of negotiations and discussions with the Commission about handling that no-deal scenario?
I think, as is apparent from the work we've done already, what is in the public domain, what the British state can do is make certain decisions about where it has the regulatory ability to do so. The question of reciprocation is, I think, what you're referring to, and there would be a very big incentive on the part of the European Commission and Member States to ensure that if we're in a no-deal context, that there was not unnecessary disruption caused to businesses both in the UK and in the EU 27. How that would be transacted, how those discussions would be taken forward is difficult to predict, but clearly we understand well, and again it's part of our advice to ministers, where action by the EU 27 and Member States is important to ensure the challenges of no deal are dealt with effectively.
Because the Secretary of State told us that he would find it difficult to imagine the EU27 not wishing to cooperate with us pragmatically to handle the fallout of no deal. So is that the operating assumption for you and your team? Is that the discussion
it is. I mean, we
continue?
can't rely on that assumption, as we are planning for every scenario, but it is part of our scenarios of planning. But if you're a fresh flower grower in the Netherlands or a strawberry grower in Spain, or you're deeply integrated into the auto industry supply chain as a manufacturer in Germany, you have a big interest in ensuring continuity of trade with the United Kingdom. The same applies in the financial services industry and so on and so forth. So there would be a very big incentive on member states, under pressure from their own businesses, to ensure that the no-deal scenario was not disruptive of trade. So that is, if you like, part of our thinking, but we have to plan across the whole range of scenarios because there are dependencies there clearly that we can't guarantee at this stage of the debate.
I mean, that would be a pretty big assumption to be working to, especially given what Michel Barnier told the committee yesterday afternoon in Brussels, and that in the event of a no deal, that's it, the discussions stop. No further discussions, no further negotiations, no side deals, no mini deals, the discussions stop.
As I say, I've not had the benefit of a full readout. We will ever get one of your discussions with Mr Barnier yesterday and what he said and precisely what the context in which he said that. What I come back to, if you look at this is a context where big interests are at stake, both in the UK and in the EU27, across a whole range of issues which impact on real people's lives, on businesses, business continuity and so on. There would be a very big incentive on both sides to mitigate the consequences of no deal. And as I say, part of my job is to ensure that ministers understand that range of scenarios, and they need confidence that we're planning across that range of scenarios, but that is part of the work that we're doing day in, day out in order to inform ministers about the choices they have to make.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Mr Rycroft, and apologies for coming late to the committee from my side. There's a very important summit coming up in Salzburg on the 20th of September. And I was just wondering what the thoughts of the department are about that summit. What would you expect to achieve from that? And to what extent do you expect Brexit to be on the agenda in a substantive way, or do you think it's sort of just going to be shoehorned in for the last 20 minutes, which is what we've seen in previous summits?
Again, thank you for your question. I'm going to sound like a stuck record, aren't I? But that is the sort of question that would be more appropriate to put to Mr Raab. You spoke to Mr Raab and Mr Robbins before the recess, but the planning for Salzburg and the position that the UK takes at Salzburg, the lobbying we do in advance of that, is led ultimately by the Prime Minister, and it would not be right for me to speculate on what plans she has in order to get the most out of that gathering.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the view of your department on no deal and how that plays into the meaningful vote that was been promised in Parliament in the autumn. It'll be such a fast-moving scenario if we imagine that there could potentially be a stalemate in Parliament. To what extent is your department prepared for different scenarios? So, if Parliament instructs the government to take a particular course of action, what that course of action might be, and how you would respond accordingly. Do you have a range of scenarios that you're looking at, or is it just one or two different options that you think you'll be working on?
So, in terms of the work across government, just to reinforce the point, that the DexEU's responsibility for preparedness in terms of what happens in a deal or a no-deal scenario, that is cross-government, not just about DexEU being ready for that. Our job to coordinate and monitor all of that. In terms of the processes for the meaningful vote, what is put to Parliament, clearly we're not at that stage yet. The work's still going on the negotiations. Ministers have made clear that the vote will be on the deal that is on the table. And again, I'm sorry, but it is really not for me to speculate what might happen beyond that point. Clearly, it is the government's intention to put a deal to Parliament which will secure the assent of Parliament, and then we can move on. The job I have then is to support ministers in the introduction and passage of the withdrawal agreement bill, which will put into UK law the necessary elements arising from our international commitments under the withdrawal agreement, particularly on citizens' rights. So we published a white paper on that, as you know, just before the recess, and a lot of work going on to ensure that we're ready for the introduction of that bill in due course.
May I just one more?
Yep.
Chair, thank you. I mean, looking at the different sectors, chemicals, food and drink, clothing, manufacturers, cars and retail, it would appear, would be the sectors most severely impacted by a no-deal scenario, by which I assume we mean moving on to WTO terms, and the substantial non-tariff barriers in particular that would be created as a result. Do you have a sector-by-sector analysis, and what specific actions are you taking according to each of those key sectors?
So this comes at various levels, of course, because there are impacts that would that there are issues which concern businesses across lots of different sectors. But then, as you hone it down, the impacts are differential depending on the sector. So there are macroeconomic issues, there are sort of systemic issues for flow of trade, and then there are sectoral issues. We, as DexEU, working across the piece, ensuring that there are competent plans in place to deal, if you like, with every level of those potential impacts. As ministers have made clear, no deal would not be without challenges, but it is my job to support ministers ensuring that we can make a success of those circumstances as well. And that does mean having a good understanding of the impact right the way across the economy. And that's done, obviously, a lot of work within departments where they lead on those particular sectors of the economy, and it is also part of the work we do, the engagement work we do, if almost as a cross-check, if you like, to ensure that we're picking up all of the relevant concerns, so that we have a good feel for where businesses see the issues that might arise in the unlikely event of a no-deal scenario.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Richard Gray.
We come in question 19, Chairman, but I'm happy to come in now. Mr. Rycroft, one of the key obstacles to agreement between the two sides on the withdrawal agreement itself is clearly Northern Ireland and the backstop arrangements. Can you just remind us what is being prepared in terms of technical notices, first of all, on the Northern Ireland situation?
So, as part of the United Kingdom, every technical notice is relevant to Northern Ireland because they are part of the United Kingdom. So if you look through the 25 technical notices that have been published so far, all have relevance to Northern Ireland. There will be some specific issues, such as the single electricity market, where there will be that will need to be addressed. But the great body of technical notices apply to Northern Ireland just as they apply to the rest of the United Kingdom.
So there's no intention to wrap up all the Northern Ireland elements, for example, into one technical notice, which could provide for an easier assessment of what would be
Again, you're asking me to, if you like, get ahead of ministers on this. It's ministers who decide when to put into the public domain what information about our no-deal planning, and that includes the question that you've just asked around Northern Ireland. But I emphasise, alongside the very detailed work we do with our colleagues in the Northern Ireland Civil Service in terms of a domestic preparedness, a deal and no-deal context, that all of the technical notices that we are publishing take into consideration the specific circumstances, not just of Northern Ireland, but also of Scotland and Wales, so that they all reflect, if you like, the interests across the whole of the UK.
I understand that, but nonetheless, I'm sure you would agree that the Irish border situation is one of the, if not the most sensitive areas, and therefore, as the department coordinating departmental responses, it would be perfectly feasible for you to make a recommendation, if you thought it was appropriate, to actually have a technical notice that combined everything to do with Northern Ireland.
We work very closely with teams across government on Northern Ireland issues. The Chair, I think, had the opportunity to question the Prime Minister, no less, on the liaison committee on the consequences of no deal in Northern Ireland, and I can do no better than, in terms of how that might be dealt with, to refer to the Prime Minister's answer to the Chair.
Right. And in terms of how the government would continue to meet the obligations of the Good Friday Agreement in the event of no deal, what sort of notice or information would you expect the government to put out on that?
So the government has made very clear in any context its commitment to no hard border border on the island of Ireland, but also to respect the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And that is, again, part of the work that we do within the civil service. Obviously, touches on the interests of a number of departments to bring that advice together so that ministers understand what decisions might have to be taken in the circumstances that you describe. Again, the assurance I can give to the committee is that work is taking place. Again, this is very sensitive, it's negotiation sensitive, it's sensitive for all sorts of reasons. But clearly, ministers have tasked us to look across the range of all of these scenarios and how they might impact on Northern Ireland as for the rest of the United Kingdom.
And I understand the sensitivities involved. Would it be fair to assume that whilst there are many people, including some on this committee, who believe that our commitment not to have a return to the borders of the past simply means we would do nothing at all, in practice our commitments to a whole range of different organisations, including the WTO, would mean that there would have to be arrangements in place for such a scenario?
I should point out, it would be remiss of me not to do so, of course, that the Chequers proposition put forward by the Prime Minister to get a deal is designed not least to ensure that the issues around there are no issues around the flow of goods and trade across that border. But I repeat what I've said. Clearly, it is part of our work to ensure that ministers understand what their responsibilities are in an international context and how that would be worked through in the event of no deal and issues arising around the border on the island of Ireland. And again, I refer you to the answer that the Prime Minister gave to the Chair on that at the Liaison Committee. I doff my hat to the
And we
Prime
would
Minister.
all, of course, obviously want a solution, a negotiated deal that allowed for no need for any potential backstop ever to be implemented. But the reality of Michel Barnier's clear comments, both in Frankfurt over the weekend and to us yesterday, was that his position was the division between trade in goods and trade in services, which is a crucial part to the ease of business between the two sides of the Irish border, was simply not acceptable. In that scenario, do you imagine the relevant departments having to step up their work for any possibility of no deal being reached?
So I'm not going to be drawn to comment on what are live negotiations to try and get us over the line in a way that deals satisfactorily with all the dimensions of the Northern Irish border. What I can say is that the civil service department that I lead and wider across other government departments stands ready to up the pace of the work as required to meet any emergent scenario. That's the job I've got to do. Ministers get good quality advice at the right time. They know what the issues are and they know what their options are to deal with those issues. It's for ministers clearly to decide how to respond to that advice and what information to put in the public domain and when to do that. Those are decisions for ministers.
Fair enough. Okay. Now, Pat McFadden, I think you wanted to come in on the back of Richard's question.
Just on the same subject, Mr. Rycroft, I'm not quite clear. The Northern Ireland situation is obviously unique because it's a land border with what will be the rest of the European Union. Are you telling us there's been a decision made not to produce a technical notice specifically on Northern Ireland, or is that a decision yet to be made?
So, I repeat what I said, that every technical notice is looked at from the context of Northern Ireland, as from the context of Scotland and Wales as well, to ensure that the interests across the UK are reflected in all those technical notices. Decisions on what further technical notices to publish and what they cover is one for ministers, and I'm not going to preempt what ministers might wish to put into the public domain or when they might do that.
It would be extraordinary in a selection of dozens of notices covering everything from Horizon 2020 to trade remedies and rural development and all the rest of it that's listed, that we didn't have one on the issue which is probably the most difficult issue in the whole negotiations right now. Why would government choose not to publish a technical paper on the heart of the border issue?
As I say, what comes in terms of publication of technical notices, we've put 25 into the public domain. There are others to follow. The content of those technical notices and the timing of which they're released into the public is a decision for ministers to take. Ministers will do that when they're ready to do so. And I'm afraid I can't go beyond that answer.
Let me ask you about a sort of issue underneath this which would be affected wherever it's dealt with, which is the common electricity market. There's reference in a report in the Financial Times of the 11th of July to a government paper referring to the use of electricity generators to try to cover the gap if there was no deal, which meant that the single electricity market wouldn't work. Have you seen that government paper?
I've seen a number of papers about the handling of the issues around the single electricity market in Northern Ireland. It's absolute matter of in the public domain. That is one of the issues that we're looking very carefully at. It is one of the 300 work streams that I've referred to earlier on. There's a lot of work gone on across government on that issue. Again, what information the government chooses to put into the public domain about its conclusions from that work is a matter for ministers. But clearly, we do understand the salience of that issue, the importance of that issue for people in Northern Ireland, and the need to ensure that there is a functioning electricity market in Northern Ireland in whatever scenario we might be in.
Is it true that that paper referred to generators on barges?
In answer to your question, I should have been a little bit clearer, Mr McFadden, I apologise for that. I said I've seen a number of papers on...
Did any of them refer to generators on barges?
Again, it would be not appropriate for me to be revealing what is advice to ministers on a sensitive issue in public domain in front of the cameras. So I'm afraid, again, I have to say that is a matter of advice that has gone to ministers, and if you wish to pursue that, more appropriate that you ask ministers.
Can you tell me where the advice came from in the trade technical notice that says we would recommend that if you trade across the land border, you should consider whether you'll need advice from the Irish government about preparations that you need to make?
You have to regard all technical notices as these are agreed across government. So that while the individual policy area is owned by different departments, Clearly, all of those of you who've been in government know the processes we have to go through in order to get stuff out into public domain, but ultimately these are government products.
Do you understand why businesses in Northern Ireland might find it a little bit unusual to be given a picture where there may not be, as you've confirmed this morning, there may not be a technical notice which specifically covers Northern Ireland, but the government has published one that says you should consider whether you'll need advice from the Irish government about the preparations you need. Wouldn't it be better if ministers of businesses in Northern Ireland could rely on sound advice from the UK government?
There is an assumption there that this is the last word to businesses in Northern Ireland or anywhere else. As I've said earlier on, there's technical notices, putting advice to businesses and others about what might pertain in the unlikely event of a no deal. Saying that the Irish government would have an interest in what happens on the island of Ireland in those circumstances, in some respects, is doing no more than stating the obvious. If we're moving into this scenario, which we don't anticipate doing, it is an unlikely scenario, I have to keep emphasising that. Clearly, there is a lot more advice that would have to go to businesses, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the UK as well. And that, and the assurance I can give to the committee, is very much part of the thinking that we're doing in DexEU, but across government, to ensure that the UK could make a success of a no-deal outcome.
Can I just ask a final broader question, which is, as you've heard, the committee went to Brussels yesterday, met Mr Barnier. You can't comment on, I expect, I understand on the results of a meeting you weren't at. I wouldn't ask you to. But we've had a lot of to and fro with your department in the last year or so over various government economic impact assessments about different things. I just want to know if a similar economic impact assessment was done across government on the Chequers proposal.
The commitment ministers have made, so answering your question, is to, when we get to the point of presenting a deal to Parliament, there will be appropriate analysis made available to members of Parliament to inform the decision they make on that deal. And clearly there was some that workings of some of that analysis got into public domain earlier this year. The work on analysis continues. When we get to that moment, ministers have made that commitment, and that's what we'll do. My job, again, is to ensure that ministers have available to them quality analysis in order to make available to members of Parliament the analysis which will help you to make the decision about that deal.
So we're not going to find similar work that was done for Chequers because work is not going to be done in that form until we know the final outcome.
Sorry, I didn't catch that question.
We're not going to find somehow, on BuzzFeed or whoever gets it this time, a set of papers around the Chequers proposals.
I did sort of lose a couple of weeks of my life when BuzzFeed got that information last time. I sincerely hope that this reaches you through the proper channels.
What is this, though? Does it exist or not? That's what I'm asking.
So the work goes on in government. This is very clear. Of course, work goes on in government across analysis, and that has to continue to adapt and change. And ultimately, we'll have to respond to the deal that is done. I can't complete that analysis until the deal is complete. But what I can do is to ensure that we're ready to do that. That's, we will be under pressure to complete that in a pretty short time space between the completion of the deal and when the meaningful vote happens in Parliament. But my job to ensure that ministers have that available to them and that the work is of appropriate quality.
Can I just come in on this, because it's not entirely satisfactory, because the question that was put, and let me put it again very directly, is in the run-up to the production of the Chequers proposals, which obviously would have implications for business, customs, costs and so on and so forth, Are you aware that officials in government, because we're asking questions about what officials in government have been doing, we understand, and there's no need to repeat it, the ministers in the end will decide what's stuck in the public domain, but have officials done any work looking at the economic impact of the Chequers proposals? And
Yes.
that's a very direct question. The answer is yes.
Yes.
So the work has been done, but it's not being published.
Is ongoing.
I got that, but work was done specifically on that, but it's not been published.
Work is
Are
ongoing.
you indicating that it might be published when we get to the end of the process?
The commitment that ministers make is very clear.
No, I've got that. I've got
Good.
that. You don't need to repeat it. I understand what that is. And secondly, on Northern Ireland technical notices, understand for ministers, but if ministers said to you tomorrow, we want to publish a technical notice on Northern Ireland, has the work been done to enable them to be given a draft by officials?
I'm confident that the work has been done across government to ensure that ministers have the information that they require.
Fine. Okay. No, that's clear. That's clear. Right, Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Rycroft. Can I, just for clarification, check what the usual process would be to prepare and approve the technical notices, particularly about no deal? You said earlier that they were submitted or published in the name of your Secretary of State, Don McGrath. Does that mean that the final civil service draft was prepared by yourself in each case and submitted to the Minister for consideration?
For the technical notices.
Yeah.
Technical notices, these are products that come from departments, but they go through a classic cross-government clearance process, which all people who've been in government will understand, to ensure that there is a collective ownership, if you like, ultimately, of what government is putting in the public domain.
Okay, but you did confirm that part of your job as Permanent Secretary is to make sure that your Secretary of State gets good quality advice and good quality analysis. Does that mean that either explicitly or implicitly all of these technical notices would have had some kind of sign-off by yourself as well as from...
They go through a very complex process, which obviously include my department manages that process. The Secretary of State is very closely involved in that. So, in terms of DexEU engagement, that is obviously we have to make sure that we're happy with these notices through that process.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned one area that is not yet in a technical notice, which is Portaloos on the approaches to Dover, and you confirmed that that detail would come from the Department of Transport in this case. And looking at the technical notices that have been issued to date, I would imagine that the one on studying in the UK and the EU, there would have been input from the Department for Education.
Exactly.
The ones about trade, there would have been input from the Department for International Trade. Many of these technical notices cover areas where responsibility lies with the devolved administrations. Where there was a clear application to Scotland, to Wales or to Northern Ireland, did the governments of those devolved nations have the same degree of input to the technical notices as the relevant Whitehall department would have for England? So for example, on the study one, did the Scottish Government have the same degree of input to that as the Department for Education in England and Wales?
The brief answer is yes. We've been consulting very closely with the devolved administrations, so the Welsh Government, Scottish Government, particularly on those notices which touch on devolved issues, to ensure that we have their input into those notices. Ultimately, these are responsibility of the UK Government, but it is very important and part of the wider stream of work, which DexEU is a big part of, to ensure that the interests of all parts of the UK are taken into account across the range of work we do, but also not just on technical notices, but on the necessary adjustments to the statute book following on from the Withdrawal Act, on domestic preparedness generally, on the progress in negotiations in Brussels, that the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government are kept fully abreast of all of that. And you will be familiar with the infrastructure we've set in place with ministers to achieve that, the JMCEN, the Ministerial Forum. But beneath that, there is a huge amount of work going on at official level to ensure that Brexit works for all parts of the UK, and that there is no interruption to business in particular across the United Kingdom, which is an important objective of the government. Obviously, with Scotland and Wales, we work very closely with their officials, but ministers work with their ministers. In the context of Northern Ireland, we work extremely closely with our colleagues in the Northern Ireland Civil Service to ensure that we understand and reflect the concerns that they have across this very, very wide range of issues that we're dealing with, which includes Erasmus and programmes such as that.
Thank you. Were external stakeholders specifically invited to contribute to the technical notices? So, for example, for Erasmus, were the universities invited to comment specifically on the technical notice, or did you just base it on what they told you about it before?
So you were quite right to say earlier on that the DFE would have been the originator of the draft of that. You'd have to ask them precisely about what discussions they'd had with the universities in putting together that proposition. What I can say with absolute confidence is that every department thinking through their technical notices will have had very close engagement with the stakeholder community relevant to that technical notice before they put pen to paper, and indeed that those discussions continue beyond the publication of the technical notices.
Thank you. And finally, in a no-deal scenario, and possibly even a deal scenario, there are things that could play out that we hope won't, where the Civil Contingencies Act would need to be implemented. In Scotland, the responsibility for civil contingencies planning and action lies with the 3 regional resilience partnerships. Has your department had discussions with those 3 regional partnerships as to their state of preparedness should the worst happen after Brexit?
So our main interlocutors is the Scottish Government, appropriately, and our discussions with the Scottish Government cover the range of scenarios that we're looking at.
So they wouldn't cover the potential need to be ready to use the Civil Contingencies Act?
We understand well where competence lies in terms of devolved and reserved responsibilities. Our discussions with the Scottish Government, as well as the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Civil Service, cover the range of scenarios from deal through to no deal to ensure that we understand any issues they've got and to ensure that the United Kingdom as a whole can succeed in the context of a no deal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Jenkins.
Thank you, Philip. My colleagues have been talking about engaging with businesses and keeping them informed in the loop. How effective do you believe your department has been in engaging with stakeholders such as businesses, government, the EU member states and the civil society?
Thank you for that question. We are managing was probably the biggest engagement exercise that any government has attempted in the last few decades. It is hugely important that we get out there to ensure that people in other member states, governments, civic society, businesses understand why it is in their interest to do a good deal with the United Kingdom. It is equally important that we have the feedback loops for businesses in the UK and in the EU 27 to understand where their concerns are, where their interests lie. So we manage that overall programme of engagement. We've upped the ante again post-Chequers, so we've had a lot of ministers out and about through the summer, if you'll have spotted, getting out around the EU 27 to make the point to other member states. And we have a very active programme of engagement, every level of the department, official and ministerial, both in terms of the EU 27 and domestically.
Thank you for that, Philip. Regarding businesses, for example, could you give an example of how you have actually engaged with businesses and got feedback, especially on the Chequers deal? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I can give you one very specific example. This is entirely coincidental, but I was in Leeds, as it happened, on Friday, Asda House, talking to Asda. And I had a morning with them, talking to different folk from that business to understand where their concerns, as one of the major supermarkets in the United Kingdom, lay in terms of the Brexit process. I was able to give them a bit of information about where we got to in the negotiations, and they were able to consolidate for me my understanding of their supply chains and what mattered to them. Actually, not just in terms of supplying to their stores, but also in terms of their of their staff, their workforce and so on. A very useful visit that builds on, for me personally, a number of other interactions I've continued to have with businesses. I was at a business dinner last night, financial services sector. I met one of the major manufacturing associations earlier last week. I met on an individual basis another financial services player.
What about SMEs then? Because in my constituency, and I'm sure in everybody's constituency here, we have tons of SMEs. How have you been engaging with those?
That is a very good question, and it's clearly, in terms of the normal flow of business, big businesses find it easier to get to government because they employ public affairs folk and so on. So trade association.
How can you overcome that then? Yeah.
So the main way we have to do that, because we can't reach directly personally every SME, is through the trade associations, so the Federation of Small Businesses, the Chambers of Commerce, who we have regular interaction with, but also, as well as where we can meet in small businesses directly, actually also meeting those like ASDA who have many small businesses in their supply chain. So there's different ways, if you like, at getting to understanding where the interests of SMEs lie in this context. And we try and bring all of that together to triangulate that, to understand, therefore, what informs policy decisions, but what also informs the information that is put into the public domain to help businesses to plan for exit in whatever form it might come.
Thank you. Final two questions,
sure,
that's okay,
sure.
Chair. Do you believe your department's fully geared up and ready to leave on the 29th of March?
Yes.
Okay.
I might, if I could expand on that answer just a little bit. The departments I have the privilege of leading has grown very rapidly over the piece, consequent on the needs of the business. So it started off at under 50. We're now past the 670 mark. We will pass the 700 mark over the next 3 or 4 months. As I say, in response to the demands that are placed on us rightly by ministers to be ready for exit on the 29th of March. We're not constrained budget-wise. We've got a generous settlement from the Treasury recognising the uncertainties of our business and how that might be moved forward. But if I may, because I think this is quite important, just to put on record the quality of the people in the department. We recruit from over 35 government departments and agencies, and that's about 2/3 of our staff. About a third of our staff come into the civil service from outside the civil service. So an incredibly diverse range of experience and talent, and a hugely talented bunch of people doing an incredible amount of hard work to deliver what is a very, very challenging programme. So if I could use the benefit of this committee just to put on record, and just so you understand, there's a lot of very brilliant people who are working very hard to deliver a successful Brexit.
I'm sure the whole committee here would also like to commend them. We know they've got one of the toughest jobs, and it's a very historic time in British history. Final question: are you aware, as head of this department, of any discussions between yourself, colleagues, or ministers about extending the transition period?
That is not government policy, so it's not something that I'm
But are you aware of any
invited to comment.
discussions going on?
I'm not aware of any discussions.
So you've not heard any yourself? Okay, thank you.
Can I just echo what Andrea said, expressing the committee's appreciation to you and to your colleagues for the important work that you're doing. It is much appreciated. It's a tough job. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Chair, and it is indeed a tough job, and we all appreciate that, and thank you for coming to give evidence to us today. Mr. Rycroft, you were talking earlier about the preparedness of government and the work streams, the 300 plus work streams that you oversee. I understand the implementation task will vary across departments. Some have many more work streams than others, and they'll be involved, I understand, in the formulation of draft legislation as well, the consultations that need to take place, the risks, etc. There were, I think, 314 work streams originally identified, and then I think that went up to 324 in your letter, 325 to the Public Accounts Committee. Is that still the number, or have they increased further?
There's a question actually. The Public Accounts Committee, I had a private session with them in early July, June, that they asked me about. The number does change. It changes to reflect the evolution of departmental planning. We're not obsessed by the number as a total. The job that we've got is to ensure that encompassed within those 300 plus work streams are all the relevant issues that pertain to exit deal or no deal. That's the job we've got to do.
I understand that, but you have the master database, don't you, at DexEU's?
Exactly.
So there will be a number in there at the moment.
Exactly, and we not only do we hold that information, we hold that at a level of detail. We need to know, we need to have the assurance that departments are not just saying, here's the title of our work stream, but they have a competent plan to deliver that work stream, that they're hitting the milestones in the work that they're doing, and we have a monthly reporting mechanism to ensure that ministers are kept abreast of that.
You do have a number of them?
Yes.
But you don't know what the number is?
The number is around the 300 mark. The precise number today I don't have in front of me.
But it's more than 324 as you...
No, it is around the 300 mark.
So the 324.25 that you gave to the Public Accounts Committee in your letter in April, it's reduced since then?
It has changed. As I say, there's no great surprise in this. The departments will sometimes split their issues and sometimes merge them.
But has it reduced or increased?
It's reduced.
It's reduced. Okay. And in terms of what's been identified, there were about 1,000 plus pieces of secondary legislation that were estimated that must be in place before we leave. Is that still the case?
There is a very large quantity of secondary legislation that needs to be taken through. Again, the numbers shift, but it is rather less than 1,000 we estimate now. But there is a very big body of work to do to make sure that the statute book is competent at the point of exit. And that means...
So that's a body of work for Parliament?
Agreed. With, obviously, supplied by the SIs, have to come out of the department. So we have a very active programme working with the Cabinet Office in terms of those who look after the legislative programme to ensure that those statutory instruments are delivered to Parliament in good time to allow members of Parliament to deliver the appropriate scrutiny.
So between October and February, we have approximately how many pieces of
the latest count. Sorry, we've started this process already. There are a number of these have been laid, but there are probably in the region of about 800 to come through the system.
Still to go through the system by about February.
Yes.
Do you think that's possible to achieve?
Our planning demonstrates that it's possible to achieve, but there's a lot of work to do to manage that.
Okay, thank you. In terms of some of the challenges that have been made about the way that your department is working, the Institute for Government had said some of the greatest challenges to your work stem from splits within the Cabinet on major policy decisions. Is that something you've experienced?
It's not something I could comment on. Clearly I work to ministers. I get very clear instructions about what I'm expected to do, and I transact to the best of my ability with the support of my department.
So, but would you? Is that holding up any of the work streams at the moment? Would you say?
I'm not. There is no hold up to the work that I have to do. I have not experienced any hold up in the work I have to do. Since I joined the department in March last year. There's a lot of work to do, but that work continues at pace across the range of the responsibilities that I have.
And there's been a culture of secrecy that's been commented on. Would you say that there is a culture of secrecy across Whitehall?
I recall the IFG report that you're referring to. I wouldn't call it a culture of secrecy. I would say there is a necessary secrecy around some of the work we do because of the sensitivities of that work. it is actually quite difficult to get the right balance, because a lot of the work that we do does require engagement right the way across Whitehall. But a lot of what we do is also very negotiation sensitive. So finding that right balance is quite tricky. We keep that under constant review to ensure that departments do have access to the right information. We have new IT systems that help us to manage that, to hold stuff at a different level of security, which does help us to get over the problems that the IFG alluded to in their report. But it is a difficult issue, and it's one that we are concerned to get right.
Right. And if I could ask you just finally, just to come back to you on the SIs, obviously the amount of work for Parliament that's going to be coming. If you talked about 800 SIs that may need to go through, and in approximately 4 months, that's 200 a month, maybe, ballpark 50 a week. You still think that's realistic?
So this is something that has been discussed a lot within government, obviously including ministers. We recognise this as challenging. It's challenging for us, it'll be challenging for Parliament. But
do you think Parliament's hours will need to be extended? Has there been any discussion of this?
That's something that you would need to I would need to refer to the leader of both houses on that to consider those sorts of issues. The job I've got to do on this is to ensure departments are delivering competent SIs ready to be laid in a sequence that will allow Parliament to do its work. We are very, very conscious of the load that we're putting on Parliament, but this is a necessary consequence.
But have there been any discussions then about extending the hours of Parliament in order to achieve?
As I say, that's not part of my job, and that again is one of those questions that I would refer you to the appropriate ministers to have that sort of discussion. It's my job to ensure that they understand what the challenge is, and also to support with the help and support of the Cabinet Office to ensure departments are delivering their SIs on the timetable that they said they would. That's ongoing work.
Okay. Thank you. Craig McKinley.
Yeah, good to have you with us again, Mr. Rycroft. I'm hoping to cover some things that you might be able to comment upon, rather than ones you can't. And it's really about the machinery of government. I understand last October was about the time that Mr. Robbins moved over from your current position to the Cabinet Office Europe unit. And we've also heard from the previous Secretary of State that he was developing his own white paper, and obviously then resigned after the Chequers deal and subsequent white papers came to light. Now, you are obviously senior in that department, nobody more senior. What was your recollection of what was going on over that period? Because it just seems to me that there were sort of parallel works going on. Were you responsible for both sides of those parallel works, the Cabinet Office, Ollie Robbins Chequers type deal, and the David Davis, his view of where we should get to? Were you doing work for two departments, as it were?
I know you had the opportunity to ask similar questions of Ollie Robbins before the recess. The answer I will give you on that is there was a DexEU white paper. We led that work. There was drafts of that white paper being prepared in normal course, which reflected collective decisions that had been arrived at collectively by ministers over the course of considerations in the months prior to the Chequers meeting.
Doing what I think you called the cross-government clearance process,
these clearly at that point is a draft, but you engage. We work incredibly closely with the Cabinet Office Europe unit, but also with other departments about the iterations of the draft. Ministers went away to Chequers to look at some of the critical issues which would inform the position that the government took, particularly on the future framework. A collective decision was reached at Chequers, and the white paper draft was adjusted and finalised on the basis of that collective agreement. So the DexEU white paper was published on the 12th of July, led by Mr. Raab, the Secretary of State for DexEU. So from that point of view, one single process, Obviously, government is complicated, lots of interest coming into that. Part of our job is to ensure that as material goes forward to ministers, that it's been winnowed and is clear, factually correct, and all the rest of it. But ultimately, that white paper reflected collective agreement across all of the policy component parts in it, and itself went through a further process of collective agreement before it was published post-Chequers to ensure that all members of the Cabinet were confident that the agreement of Chequers was accurately captured in that white paper.
So are you telling me then that the white paper that was being developed under the previous Secretary of State, it became the Chequers white paper by a means of subtle evolution, or was there an alternative white paper being developed within the Cabinet Office Europe unit?
The answer to your question is in the first place.
What I've discussed with Mr. Davis, and there's been bits and pieces on various websites, it looked a very different document. I can't believe that was a simple evolution. It almost seemed like it came from different parents.
The answer to your two alternatives is the first, that I wouldn't necessarily use the word subtle, because clearly Chequers was a big moment. I mean, this was when some of the most difficult issues were discussed by the entire Cabinet. They took decisions, and then that was reflected in the finalisation of the white paper. So that's the process that was undertaken.
So you're absolutely telling me there was one process that at the final stages it became Chequers?
Yes.
Okay. Now just going back to some of these analyses that we had lots of discussions about earlier on in the year, the sectoral analyses, and we had to have the parliamentary process to get them published eventually. Now, it seems the Treasury is very much involved with its own sort of views on what post-Brexit Britain under different scenarios might look like. They don't always coalesce in full agreement with what your department might have produced. Can you understand people's concerns when you have estimates of where Britain might be in 15 years' time, when we have various government departments don't seem to be able to get the estimation of where next year would look like exactly right, and given what happened by the Treasury's forecast before the referendum, where there'd be 500,000 to 800,000 unemployed, a contraction of GDP, an emergency budget, higher interest rates and general damnation, that hasn't actually come to pass. Can you understand people's concerns when they see some of these analyses coming out of your department or the Treasury or the Bank of England? They're not really as assured as they might be, because what happens you can sort of judge the future by what you've seen in the past, and what we've seen in the past hasn't come to pass. So have we got any greater confidence in what we're seeing now?
Thank you for that question. It is quite important that people understand the nature of the work that we're doing. It is analysis of different scenarios. You're aware of what the work was done because it got into the public domain. That work continues, as I said. The crucial landing point for that in the next little while is the commitment of government to make analysis available to members of Parliament to inform the decision that's taken on the deal that is done. But just in terms of what that analysis is, it's not forecasts. This is very distinct from the normal budget, OBR type short-term economic forecasts. This is economic modelling, which takes a range of inputs, a range of factors, knowing what the world is now, and projecting that forward and trying to understand through that modelling what might happen in the economy under different circumstances. That's the first point. The second point, which is equally important, this is not deterministic. It does not say that, given these circumstances, the modelling says that that is what would happen in that future, because, of course, with that information, governments can do things. So if there is a risk over here, for example, that there may be skill shortages in a particular sector of the economy, the government can take action to address that, particularly over the timescales we're taking. So I'm very confident in the quality of this work. We are drawing on the best economic analysis and analysts across government, but I think it is important that people understand the nature of the work that is being done. This is not about short-term forecasting.
Just, you can understand my concern that pre-referendum there was lots of output of government trying to change people's vote effectively by fear or whatever reason. And most of it was on fear that there'd be a dreadful outcome and Britain would fall apart. It hasn't come to pass. So now you're saying that, say, Chequers is actually put forward and codified into something to be put to Parliament. Somewhere, no doubt your department will be putting together what that might mean economically for Britain, and I'm sure the Treasury do the same, and the Bank of England as well. That would be, the main reason for that would be to inform our vote and perhaps to steer us to either supporting it or not. Should we have any greater confidence on that than what we've seen in the past?
The main purpose of the analytical work I do, or I oversee from a DexEU perspective, is to ensure that ministers take decisions based on the evidence they have before them. Again, it doesn't constrain those decisions, it informs those decisions, and the same applies when that information is presented to Parliament. But of course, ministers will determine what analysis is put as quite appropriate. Ministers will determine what analysis is put forward in meeting their commitment to ensure that members of Parliament are informed in taking their decision on the deal that is done.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just press a little bit further on these questions of the fiscal impact and the work that's being done in looking at what the fiscal impact of a no-deal outcome would be? The Chancellor has written to the Treasury Select Committee in the last couple of weeks on this, and his letter makes the point, and I quote, the January analysis estimated that borrowing would be around 80 billion a year higher under a no-deal WTO scenario by 2033-34, so in the 15-year time horizon that Craig McKinley has been referring to. That estimate of 80 billion a year higher borrowing, is that the outcome of the cross-government process coordinated by your department that you've been describing to us today?
The Chancellor has to make clear this was drawing on the analysis that went into the public domain in January, not complete analysis, not reflecting Chequers clearly, because that was way before Chequers, not reflecting the deal that has been that will hopefully be done over the next few weeks. Job I've got with the team working on this and across Whitehall is to ensure that analysis is brought up to date for ministers to reflect the progress in the negotiations and the deal that is done. Right. And that's what we're doing.
So is the fact that the figure 80 billion a year higher borrowing was worked out in January, was that a sort of Treasury figure rather than a coordinated cross-Whitehall figure in the sort of process that you're now leading? That
reflected the work that had been done cross-Whitehall on that analysis that went into the public domain at that time.
So it was a cross-government estimate?
There was a process that we helped to coordinate in DexEU, part of our work. But of course, what came into the public domain was not the finished article by any means. It was work in progress.
So the Chancellor's letter goes on to say what you've just told us, that the initial January cross-Whitehall analysis is now undergoing a process of refinement in the run-up to a parliamentary vote on the deal. However, he says, we expect the analysis to show that for scenarios in which we have higher barriers to trade with the EU, there will be a more damaging effect on the economy and public finances. Can I just check that second sentence, where the Chancellor says we expect the analysis to show higher barriers to trade, more damaging effect on the economy, does that reflect a cross-Whitehall view?
That reflects the Chancellor's view of what he knows of the analysis at this stage. Of course, neither he nor anybody else can have a complete picture of that analysis at this stage, because we've not yet got to the end of the process of negotiating that deal. So that's where the analysis will reach its conclusion at this stage of the process. and from that will be drawn information, as the Chancellor's letter reflects, that will be put to MPs.
So you're saying that the view that higher barriers to trade with the EU will lead to a more damaging effect on the economy and public finances, that is not yet across Whitehall view, that is simply the Chancellor's view?
So the Chancellor is reflecting the work that has been done hitherto, drawing on the January analysis. We're not yet at the point, clearly, where that analysis has been concluded in terms of what the UK government anticipates to be the outcome for the UK, assuming a deal is done, and that's the work that continues across government as we speak.
Yes, but the Chancellor says he expects the analysis to show that higher barriers to trade means more damage to the public finances. Do you expect that's what the analysis would show as well?
That's drawing on the analysis from January. That was one of the conclusions you could draw from that. That's why it's in the Chancellor's letter. What the conclusions are from the completion of that work, I can't say, and nor can anybody else, because the work's not completed.
The Chancellor's letter from a fortnight ago does say we expect the analysis to show that, as I definitely, you're clearly not willing to endorse that, which I understand. Just can you just tell us a little bit more about how your department is working with the Treasury and no doubt other government departments as well, specifically on this work on the fiscal impact of no deal?
Ministers obviously need a collective view from across the civil service on the analysis and what it tells us about the deal that's on the table. So we have to draw that together, and that's part of the work that we do. So involving the Treasury, but other government departments as well, such as DIT, and so that the Cabinet Secretary ultimately can take an informed view of that analysis and present it as a civil service product to ministers.
So when in the end a revised version of the £80 billion figure is produced, is that your department's responsibility to produce that number, or the
This will be a cross-government product.
But who will actually work out the figure, I suppose?
I mean, it's like a lot else that goes on in government. Part of the job of the civil service, working across different departments, is to give ministers as clear a view as we can of what the analysis is saying, and that's what we'll endeavour to do. Therefore, if there is a number or numbers in this analysis, those numbers will be derived from cross-government work, with ultimately the Cabinet Secretary taking a view on that and presenting a product to ministers.
Okay. What, just on this specific point?
Yes.
Very quickly, then Joe.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Rycroft, isn't the responses that you've just given indicative of some of the challenges that were also there in the Institute for Government report, talking about where some of the criticisms were talking about the coordination of work across 20 departments, no clear end state, poor information flow, competing ministerial preferences? Isn't this another illustration where you're unable to give a straight answer about even who would be responsible?
No, I think that's a bit unfair. I didn't necessarily agree with all the conclusions of the IFG report. We have a extensive programme of engagement across a whole range of issues.
But somebody has to take responsibility, and
I take responsibility for the coordination of Brexit-related work across the many domains of Brexit. The analysis is one of them. Also domestic preparedness, deal, no deal, dealing with international agreements, engagements, relations with the devolved administrations. There is a very big programme of cross-Whitehall work. We sit down with departments constantly to ensure that this is well coordinated. That's the job that I've got to do, and hopefully transact that job to the best of my abilities.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Rycroft. One of the major impacts will be on foreign relations and trade relations. We will be a third country to 27 other countries with whom we are not currently a third country. and that has considerable impact on the conduct of foreign affairs and trade matters. Could I just ask what is being done or has already been done to strengthen bilateral representation, firstly in the 27 other, actually we've got to include the 4 EEA countries as well, so the 31 other countries with whom we will be a third rather than a second or a first country as from March next year?
So that is absolutely identified as one of the issues that we've got. Foreign Office lead, clearly, it's their responsibility to ensure that the missions in EU 27 are up to scratch now. And this work has increased already. This is not about waiting for exit the 29th of March or indeed the end of an implementation period. This is now. It's their job to ensure that the staff and the capability is there. The details of that, again, I would refer you to the Foreign Office, how they manage that. I have a particular concern with UCREP. You were there yesterday. You met some of the very talented folk in UCREP who are doing themselves a very tough job in these circumstances. But UCREP has to transform itself from a permanent representation of a member state to being a third country mission. And that is a conversation and a planning exercise with Sir Tim Barrow and with the Foreign Office that we're very deeply engaged in. All of that nests within in a wider context of preparedness of the civil service, both in its diplomatic, trade side, but also domestic side, to be ready for the very big challenges that come with Brexit, to be able to take up the opportunities, to undertake and transact the business that comes back to the UK in terms of regulation and so on. This is a very big challenge. And it is part of my job, but in this case working with John Manzoni's team in the Cabinet Office to think about that from a resourcing perspective and from a capability perspective, to work with Sir Simon MacDonald in the Foreign Office, Sir Tim Barrow in UCREP, to understand the implications of that for the diplomatic network and specifically for UCREP. It's a big programme of work and we are on it.
Do you know how many additional staff the Foreign Office and the Department of International Trade have recruited for those 31 different missions? Plus,
for the different missions, no, I don't know the precise number. Very happy to write to you if that would be convenient.
That would be helpful.
But in terms of DIT itself, of course, that was a department that has grown very substantially over the last couple of years in order to be ready to take on the task of negotiating new trade deals and managing our trade relationships across the globe.
And of course, it's not just within Europe. There are many parts of the globe where we do not, or some parts where we do not have a representation in each country, but the European Commission does have a representation which acts on our behalf as a member state. It will no longer act on our behalf as a member state. How many new missions where we are currently effectively represented through the EU are you aware that the Foreign Office is proposing to open to counter that deficiency that will be there from the end of March 2019?
The precise number I don't have, but the precise issue clearly is one of those issues that is of concern across government. I can include the numbers in the letter that I will write to you.
I would like both the numbers and the names of the countries so that we can match where we currently have representation through the EU when we don't have our own mission with where we will be in April 2019.
I'm very happy to do that, but with the caveat, of course, is that I don't have the precise numbers, but nor in terms of the rollout of the Foreign Office plans. Some of this may be in being at the moment, some of it may be planned in public domain,
but
some of it may be...
This is such a germane matter for exiting the European Union that it's got to be of the absolute highest priority, and the Foreign Office must be disclosing that information to you.
I will get you the information that is public domain.
Thirdly, there is the question going back to within the European Union, we will now be excluded from all sorts of contacts on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis where we pick up valuable information which will no longer be available to us. What additional resources are we seeking to put in place so that we can be aware of that kind of information. I'm not talking about, top secret information or things like that. What I'm talking about is the day-to-day business that currently we are party to, and we will be excluded unless we go into some kind of EEA type arrangement from April 2019, which requires a lot of human resources.
I agree with that, and there are 2 or 3 dimensions. There's of course part of the negotiations for the implementation period itself, but also for the future relationship, is about what access the UK will have in terms of working groups, technical committees and so on, to be able to participate in those discussions, even if without voting rights. So how much access we get is a factor of the negotiations. But your underlying point is absolutely right. We're not going to be a member state. We're not in the institutions. And it is partly a question of numbers, but it's also partly a question of different capabilities and skill sets. So to be able to work the Brussels Beltway in a way that elucidates, if you like, the information that's required to inform decision-making by ministers back here will require UCREP in particular to act in a very different way. It will come as no surprise to you. I don't know whether you discussed this with colleagues in UCREP yesterday when you had the opportunity to do so, but talking to other third country missions, whether it's Canada or the US or the Norwegians, to understand how they go about that business. We recognise it's a different sort of challenge. And just as in DexEU we're growing the capability of a lot of folk who will be able to take that understanding of how we manage our relationship with the EU as a non-member state out round Whitehall in the future, so we've got to work with UCREP to ensure that they can make that transition in good time, and that's what we're doing.
Are you aware that the Department of International Trade is actually reducing its representation in certain parts of the world at a time when it would seem obvious to us that it should be increasing it? Sorry, if I may just add to that. Sorry, if you'd like to come back on that, and then I have one final question.
Just on that, as I say, I'm Permanent Secretary of the Department for DexEU in the EU. It's an issue you should raise with DIT itself.
But of course, that has a direct impact on us exiting the EU, because one of the main gains that is supposed to come from exiting the EU is we're supposed to increase trade in parts of the world where we currently underperform, and yet in those very parts we are seeing reductions in the number of Department of International Trade staff. You must be aware of that.
So clearly future trade deals and improving our trading relations across the globe is one of the big opportunities emerging from Brexit. How that is transacted beyond the EU is a matter for DIT, and in terms of the way they deploy their resources, how they do that, whether they have sufficient resources to do that, is a question, if I may say so, that you should take up with them.
And finally, I hope you may have an answer to this question. What is the estimate of the additional cost of all the overseas representation which we are now going to need, quite rightly, to put in place, whether it's on diplomacy, on information gathering, on trade, compared with what it is at the moment?
I don't have that estimate, and again, I can cover this in the letter I've now promised to write. But of course, this is there's no fixed points in this, so how that evolves and changes over time will have to reflect the circumstances that we find ourselves in. This is about good, sensible planning across government in this context by the Department for International Trade and the FCO. And if, in terms of more detailed understanding of that, it's appropriate for those departments to respond to it.
But if I were to put a figure of in the hundreds of millions as opposed to the tens of millions of pounds a year that we're going to need to spend additionally to ensure that we have that representation globally and within the EU that's required with the new circumstances, you wouldn't demur from that?
What I can say is, from the point of view of my own department, we have 670 odd folk now, outturned this year in the region of £65 million. That gives you some idea of the quantum in financial terms. Across Whitehall, plans already committed to recruit staff to support exit work. We're approaching around the 7,000 mark, and there will be 9 or 10,000 on current plans to come into the Whitehall context. That is all supported by the money that the Treasury has made available, the £3 billion over 2 years, so the money is there to support that activity. and I'm confident for my department I have the resources I need to do that. But just to come back to the point and to emphasise the point, this is not just about quantum. This is also about capability and the quality. And this is a very big challenge for the civil service, and one no doubt this committee will have an interest in over time, how the civil service is adapting and responding to circumstances, being ready for life once we leave the EU March 29 next year, and again once we leave the implementation period at the end of December 2020. But to give you assurance, it is part of the thinking that we have, and come back to what was the purpose of the discussion, thinking about the machinery of government change. The very clear, if you like, instruction on me that was captured in the written ministerial statement from the Prime Minister to be thinking about preparations for what happens beyond achieving a deal later this year. It is hugely important that government has the capability to think ahead, and that's part of the job that we have.
Okay. Now, John Whittington wanted to come back on one point.
Just one very quick question. We've spent a lot of time discussing the sector-by-sector analyses that DexEU's conducted on the impact of no deal on British business. Can you confirm that DexEU's also conducted a parallel exercise looking at the economic interests of each member state in the UK and how they will be affected by no deal?
The brief answer to your question is yes, of course. We understand the nature of the business links from the EU 27 in the UK, and the trading links and the dependencies across different sectors. That is part of the work that we do.
So there is an analysis, country by country, of what the effect on them would be if it were?
Yes.
And are you intending to publish those?
Not in immediate plans, but it's certainly information that is informing decisions that ministers take about their position across the range of scenarios that we're planning for.
But if the committee asks for the publication of those documents, obviously that will be for the ministers to decide.
It would, just thinking about that point, it'd be hard to argue that it would damage the negotiations, because presumably the countries themselves know what their economic interests are in the UK. So
there are arguments on that both ways, I think, Chair. But again, this is probably
what's
a
the other
discussion
way?
for the ministers.
What's the other way against publication?
Just in terms of, as I think, if I remember, when I was previously at the committee, in terms of the sectoral analysis, it's sort of a little bit doing the homework of the Commission for it, and something applies in that space well. But this is a decision for ministers.
Okay. Can I just, one final question for me, coming back to the point that Mr. Bone was making earlier, which is the timing of notifying businesses if it turns out that a deal is not going to be reached. And the question I wanted to ask was this, because clearly this has enormous financial, reputational implications for businesses. Have you discussed, I'm not asking you to talk about legal advice, have you discussed as one of the possibilities you might have to consider is the possibility of either private litigation or judicial review against the government on the grounds that there has been late or inadequate notification, which has then impacted upon commercial operations?
As I said in answer to earlier questions, the work that we do covers a very wide range.
Yeah, no, I've got that. No need to repeat it. The question was, is that one issue that you have considered?
We
that
have
there
to
might
understand
be judicial
all the
review
possible,
or private litigation. Pardon?
We have to understand all the possible implications.
And this is one of the possibilities.
We have to understand all the possible implications for government. If I might.
So you're not willing to say whether it's one of the possibilities that you've thought about?
I'm not going to reveal in further detail the planning that we're doing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming today and for giving evidence. We really do appreciate it. Order, order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding